Good afternoon, everybody. This is a live update on the potential for a tropical cyclone to form in the Gulf of Mexico next week. The National Hurricane Center has decreased that probability to 40% over the next 7 days. But Ensemble forecasts do support a tropical cyclone possibly developing in the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico and then sliding toward the west coast of Florida. Here you can see some of the Ensemble model imagery. This is a GFS Ensemble, which shows a much weaker system headed toward the west coast of Florida, Tampa down to Fort Myers, even southern Florida could get a rainmaker potentially. You're looking at the minimum pressure of all of the individual ensembles that I'm showing you right now, the ensemble members, and basically when they're clustered together, they're a lot higher confidence. And this forecast is particularly important to the recovery effort because that is still well underway. And a lot of that recovery effort is from private citizens with helicopters, private charity groups. I've heard that the federal response was a little bit late getting down there, and that includes from my mom. She says down there in western North Carolina, it's a lot like the Hurricane Katrina, but with mountainous terrain. Areas like Asheville completely flooded out, Biltmore Village, isolated communities in the mountains of western North Carolina, outside of Boone, the Swannanoa River Valley out there, even into eastern Tennessee and western Virginia up there near Rowan Mountain has some big issues. And the CMC model last night shows a hurricane headed toward western Florida toward the middle of next week, but it should be noted that a lot of models show a much weaker system, including the most recent CMC model, but this one does show a problem heading up into the Tampa Bay area, and this would be another area that was very hard hit by Hurricane Helene. But notice this strong area of high pressure that's dominating the eastern U.S. by this time. That should prevent a tropical cyclone from rocketing north inland into the United States and especially impacting this very disaster-prone area of the southern Appalachians. We always said in our live briefings leading up to Helene that this would be a big problem. Anytime you get a tropical cyclone ejecting northeast that runs into that mountainous terrain, it squeezes out all of its moisture, aided by the sloping terrain. You got this mountain range here, and when you get that pipe of moisture going uphill, it squeezes out all that moisture. And the bad thing is that it squeezes it out near the crest of the Appalachians. That's where you had 30 plus inches of rain. One rain gauge had 35 inches of rain there near the crest of the Appalachians, and all that flows downhill. You get debris flowing down, you get landslides. That's why you've seen some of that crazy video of these landslides moving at like 100 miles an hour downhill, just causing major freaking problems. And one good piece of news is that the 12Z CMC model has weakened that hurricane, and it's sending it a little bit further south. There's a little bit more wind shear, high pressure just dominating up here, and that leads to a little bit of wind shear off to south of it near its southern periphery, especially as you get a little bit closer to that zone. But mainly it blocks that northward progression of a tropical cyclone and tries to shunt it off to the south over the central and southern Florida peninsula and eventually offshore. Even if it does take that weaker, further south track, it still would likely be a rainmaker down there in central and southern Florida, so we do have to keep a very close eye on it. But I do want to break down some of the forecast model ensemble imagery, and I was going to be looking at this time normally for chasing severe weather during the second season, but we are still looking at the tropics, and I think we'll probably have at least one more tropical system to go through here. But this is the weekend 84-hour forecast. This is the 0Z European model ensemble to give you an idea of some of the steering currents. And look at that over the Gulf of Mexico. Let me bend this back to the west so that you can see it a little bit more. We are breaking down this forecast, and then Gizmo and I are going to be headed east to help out in the recovery effort. Gizmo's been a little bit sick recently. I left her with her babysitter when I went down to intercept Helene down to the Florida Big Bend region, and I had to come back to Oklahoma to retrieve Gizmo, and then I'm driving back out, dropping Gizmo off at my mom's place, and I'm going to help out over the next several days there in western North Carolina. We have Team Dominator Storm Recovery, an organization that we're setting up, but we don't have our insurance yet, so we weren't able to send people out in the field without partnering with people like Mercury One, also Aerial Recovery Group, the United Cajun Navy. Mercury One has been out there. They've been helping out a lot. Been working with them as well. And here you can see by the weekend, you do have a lot of shear over the northern Gulf of Mexico. At least the steering currents are kind of off to the northeast. So once this tropical system does form, it does look like it's going to be heading off to the east rather than north. And it's a lot different than when Helene came in. You had that upper level low that was sitting here over the lower Mississippi River Valley, and that basically launched Helene right up into the southern Appalachians at a speed of over 20 miles an hour. You also had that predecessor rain event ahead of the upper level low, basically telegraphing the path of Helene. And you may remember in the live updates, we kept saying what a mega disaster that would be if that tropical cyclone slammed into the southern Appalachians. I do have huge regret that I didn't target my mom's backyard in the southern Appalachians there in western North Carolina. Instead, I went for the inner core of that hurricane. But you can definitely see that there is some wind shear down there. That's why this thing doesn't just blossom. And until it starts moving off to the northeast at a good clip in a storm relative sense, it looks like this little bit of an upper level low here, kind of a vorticity streamer, might have a little bit of wind shear along its southern periphery. But the CMC still strengthens that thing into a hurricane, and we're going to look at some of the individual members here on the European model. And you can also look at all those members in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see all those areas of low pressure down here in the Gulf. And you have a little bit of a high pressure that is dominating here. Whenever you have a ridge trough pattern in the inflection zone in between to the east of that ridge and to the west of the trough, that's where you get the surface high pressure. That's what that big H is showing you. And that should act as a bit of a blocking pattern here for the eastern coast. And this should cause any hurricanes or tropical cyclones to form to go south toward the west coast of Florida. If this slides offshore, though, and it takes a long time to develop, it could easily slide into the weakness kind of on the western edge of that surface high pressure. And that's why the National Hurricane Center still has that broad area of interest down in the Gulf of Mexico that could form. But let's take a look at some of those individual members. The GFS model, interestingly, does not blossom it as much as the European model members do, or especially the CMC. But we're going to look at some of these individual forecast model members. You can see some of these are quite low. Got a 997 back here. Got a couple that are back toward the western Gulf of Mexico. This is on Sunday, coming up this weekend. This is October 6th. And it does seem like you get a couple fast movers, weaker tropical cyclones that might head up toward the Tampa area by early next week. But those that take a little bit longer to develop have the potential to be just a little bit stronger. We'll step forward on the European model Ensemble. Notice how you have some darker blues that are happening. That means some of these low pressures are starting to get a little stronger. 997, right around 1,000. Nothing really blossoming. You get a couple of the low 990s there. You have one down a little closer to the Yucatan, down to the upper 980s that could be a little bit stronger. Definitely seeing some discrepancies in timing of development and even whether development happens at all in the European model. Now we're looking at next Monday night, and you can see there are a couple that are a little bit lower. You got a 983 up there. That's a little faster by Monday night. That could be getting a little bit closer to the west coast of Florida. Probably going to be a weaker tropical cyclone, at least that's what my gut tells me, sliding a little bit further south toward the central or southern Florida peninsula. That would be most likely. The GFS ensembles are a little bit less likely for development of a tropical cyclone and a little bit slower by Tuesday morning. You got a couple down here that are a little weaker, but I think that this just kind of feels southwest to northeast oriented deep layer wind shear, and you have a warm body of water out here. Temperatures like upper 20s to around 30 degrees Celsius, but there appears to be some wind shear that could be at play. Anytime you get those height contours that are tightly stacked. But the longer it takes, it's possible that conditions could get a little bit more favorable for development toward the middle of next week, and especially if you have some further west members. Interestingly, you got another member up here in the northeastern quadrant of this spin that is dropping down into the upper 970s. That's one of the GFS model ensemble members that could come in there just a little bit stronger up into the eastern Gulf of Mexico. So I'm not seeing quite as much of an indication that this will intensify, at least according to the GFS. It looks a little bit less likely. Here's the icon model. There are some weather weenies that are a fan of this model, and in fairness, The Icon did a pretty good job on some of the recent models. This is on Saturday night this weekend. It shows kind of a weaker tropical cyclone forming over the western Gulf of Mexico. You get kind of a competition with a couple of gyres out there in the Gulf. And the Icon model maintains a relatively weak tropical cyclone, moving it across the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Starts to try to intensify it a little bit to the north of the Yucatan, but just a little bit too much in the way of wind shear. And the Icon model doesn't really blossom this tropical cyclone. This is last night's model, taking it as kind of a broad area of tropical low pressure right into the west coast of Florida. If this happened, this would still cause problems down here in southwestern Florida, but it's not like a Cat 2, Cat 3, Cat 4 type of a hurricane, not even a hurricane, in fact. But you do have a lot of warm water out there in the Gulf of Mexico, and you know how things go. Just sometimes they end up being a little bit stronger. But we do have kind of an area of strong westerly mid and upper level winds right across the Gulf of Mexico, and I think that that wind shear should prevent this from becoming a really significant tropical cyclone. I probably see it as more of a rainmaker out in the Gulf of Mexico, eventually moving closer toward the west coast of Florida. Almost a hybrid tropical system in a way. But you do get a lot of that spin over the Gulf of Mexico. Looking at the operational GFS model, just kind of a lot of spin over the Gulf, but nothing that really blossoms. Really, the CMC model last night blossomed in an area of low pressure, but this is on Sunday. You just kind of get these little areas of spin out here in the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing too significant that tries to blossom, but I do think that there's going to be a lot of rainfall across the central and southern Florida peninsula. You can definitely see that as being evident anytime you get these tropical waves that are coming up. Looks like there could be quite a bit of rainfall too. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a flooding situation for the central and southern Florida peninsula. You're looking at the operational GFS model, and this just blossoms, double-digit rainfall, sliding very close to the west coast of Florida, central southern Florida. And this is the solution even that doesn't have a very powerful tropical cyclone. Basically just has a weaker tropical cyclone moving across the Gulf of Mexico, impacting the west coast of Florida with very heavy rain. But the good news is that it doesn't lift this thing northward, and that's because we have a totally different upper level pattern at play. And instead of having that upper level low and the Fujiwara interaction, we have a much simpler upper level pattern. And it brings the jet stream way up into Canada. Notice how you have basically a ridge trough pattern that tries to develop. But look at this kind of subtropical jet down here of strong westerlies up at 300 millibars. This is the wind shear that's going to be in place across the Gulf of Mexico weekend into early next week. And that is probably why a lot of the models are showing a weaker system. Kind of have the subtropical jet that begins to develop during the second season, during the fall. Usually during the spring, fall, and especially the winter, that's when the jet stream is most active, especially if you have some warm water out there in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. That'll give you a more energized subtropical jet. This tells me that we might be getting a little bit late in the season to get a ripper out there in the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico, but we are going to continue to keep a very close eye on this thing. You still have that strong westerly winds down here of the Gulf of Mexico, which is a good sign for that area down there. But remember, the CMC model still tries to intensify a Category 1 type of a hurricane out there. So Gizmo and I are about to button up Team Dominator headquarters, and we are going to be heading down toward the Western Carolinas to help out. Even though we're a few days late, we've been helping out by bridging together disaster recovery efforts down there, individuals as well, like Chris Hall that has been down there Mr. Hendricks has been working hard down there as well. Vince Welty, Brandon Kopic just left the zone after dropping off some Starlinks. Ryan Hall has been down there sending out Starlinks to the zone. But we got to watch this area of spin down in the Gulf of Mexico and across the southeastern U.S. And eventually, Team Dominator Storm Recovery is going to be ready to rock and roll. But we don't have our insurance quite ready, and so we have to work with partners. We can shine a light on partners that are already set up. Operation Barbecue Relief has been out there. Operation Airdrop, a group of private citizens, helicopters and aircraft dropping supplies in the southern Appalachians out there. So one thing I'm noticing, and this is some good news, is that there's a lot of wind shear over the Gulf of Mexico, and I think that any tropical system that is born out of this will probably be more of the hybrid type. It'll probably have some subtropical characteristics to it. Should come out of the Gulf of Mexico as a slightly weaker tropical cyclone, but even a tropical storm or a tropical depression or a subtropical tropical hybrid moving up toward the west coast of Florida could cause an impactful storm surge, and we already had an impactful storm surge down near Clearwater Beach. Florida Big Bend had a big-time storm surge west of Steinhatchee over toward Keaton Beach. Alligator Point, where we had the subsonic sensor mounted, and it's getting shipped back to us right now. That should have some very valuable data on it, some infrasound as Hurricane Helene was intensifying over the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. But look at this high pressure that should be dominating the eastern U.S. You have a lot of these northerlies too at the surface, kind of wrapping into that developing cyclone. Looks to me like it's going to be more of a subtropical type of a hybrid, but big wind field. A lot of times these subtropical hybrid storms can have big wind fields. They can have big storm surge as well. And so these late season tropical cyclones can be a big problem. The GFS down there also kind of has that subtropical low forming down over the Gulf of Mexico. They can still cause problems, but it's not going to be a mega disaster at least. I bet we will get a tropical cyclone or some type of a hybrid that's going to form out of the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico down there. And I do think that's going to have impacts down in Florida, either as more of a rainmaker down across Florida, a prolonged rainmaker event. Some of the global models even have double-digit totals near the central Florida peninsula, Tampa, down along the west coast of Florida. But when you get these big wind fields like this, a lot of times it means it's more of a subtropical low. And the National Hurricane Center has reduced this probability to about 40% down there in the Gulf of Mexico. But probably you're going to get more of a subtropical type of a development down there in the Gulf of Mexico, and that'll likely slide over the southern tip of Florida toward the middle of next week. And boy, look at this. You actually get a lot more in the way of these deep easterlies all along the eastern seaboard. So I wouldn't be surprised if this subtropical low, as it moves over the Florida peninsula, could trigger the development of broad onshore flow across that concave portions of the southeastern U.S. That could lead to some coastal flooding down there. Areas like coastal South Carolina, coastal Georgia, east coast of Florida could be impacted. Look at this broad belt of accelerated easterly winds over top these upper level lows down here. That's going to lead to a broad area of that big easterly flow happening. So this is a live update here. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you new Team Dominator members for tuning in. We are going to resume those pure Team Dominator member streams coming up after this. Yeah, that high pressure is a beautiful thing. You definitely need that to hold up there, but you know how the tropics go, folks. Those systems that are out in the open Atlantic, it looks like they are going to recurve. And we can take a look at some of these. You gotta be kidding me with this. Here is the GFS model out in the open Atlantic. Showing you what I believe, is that Kirk that's out here? That's a forecast for later. There it is. There it is in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We'll go 24 hours. You have this upper level low up near Bermuda. That's probably going to provide a lot of wind shear. So I don't think that's going to become a threat to Bermuda. 966 millibar ripper here. These are the Lesser Antilles. Lesser Antilles down here. There's your 966 central pressure. And that thing should recurve, everybody. Look at that, just lifting off to the north. Still, it's going to be a fairly intense hurricane. That's going to boost those ACE values, your accumulated cyclone energy. Overall, it has been a below normal season, and it only takes one hurricane. So some news is that one should be more of a fish storm. You got another storm system on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. That's also going to be a strong one. But this time of year, when these hurricanes form out in the open Atlantic, they usually recurve. And you also have kind of a hostile open Atlantic. You get a lot of wind shear out there. And you really need these late season hurricanes to form a little bit closer to the coastline. But look at that onshore flow that's being modeled down here out near October 10, near the East Coast. You'll probably have a lot of that onshore flow, a lot of coastal flooding that's going to happen out there near the East Coast of Florida, from Florida up through the Carolinas. But you definitely have a lot of low pressure systems, a lot of wind shear out here. And those are definitely not going to be a threat to the East Coast. We definitely need to watch that Central American gyre down there. Down in the Caribbean. That is what we're watching. And this is what I mean by a Central American gyre down here. We are down near the Yucatan. And usually what happens is these easterly trade winds will kind of develop cyclonic curvature right near Nicaragua and near Honduras. And then you'll get a westerly surge across Central America. A lot of times you'll get two tropical cyclones, one that'll form over the Pacific West Coast. We had Hurricane John that came ashore as a Category 3 with 17 fatalities out there near Acapulco, near the same areas that were ravaged by Hurricane Otis last year. And then a lot of times you'll get another tropical cyclone that'll form on the Atlantic side. Sometimes you'll get some of that old spin, like from Hurricane John, that'll migrate back over, get into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the northwestern Caribbean, and even those will intensify into a tropical cyclone and even a hurricane. But not seeing that right now. It looks like toward the weekend, we could get a subtropical low that'll form right here, and you'll see those winds turn to more northeasterly and northerly. The CMC model, though, does take it as a well-organized tropical cyclone up toward the west coast of Florida. But overall, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to probably be more of a subtropical low as it heads up toward the coastline of Florida, but still could bring some impacts, maybe even double-digit rainfall totals too. Let's look at some of the rainfall totals across the Florida Peninsula being modeled by some of these other forecast models, not just the GFS, and we're also looking at last night's run. 12Z is already out. This is the latest GFS model. Look at some of those totals there over the central and southern Florida Peninsula. Those are double-digit rainfall totals over central southern Florida, and it has shifted just a little bit south. So that's the 12Z GFS model. NAM model isn't out quite far enough just yet. The 12Z European model has a lot of that heavy rain just offshore, double-digit rainfall coming on shore near Fort Myers. That could easily happen too. So it does look like, at the very least, this could end up being a very rainy week down in Florida. Some areas, if this rain comes on shore in the west coast of Florida, could easily get double-digit type rainfall. And that's what's being indicated by the European model there in some of those browns, oranges, yellows out there. If this is able to come on shore, we could have some big problems out there in terms of double-digit rainfall totals on the west coast of Florida. Got the Fort Myers area down near Naples as well. Looks like the east coast of Florida, a lot less in the way of rainfall. So the models are kind of showing it doesn't really want that thing to come on shore. So there you have it, everybody. That is the latest out here in the tropics. Pretty important live update just because there are so many rescue efforts that are happening down in Florida right now. But the good news is that you're not going to have a repeat of Helene. But we are definitely watching this area. We have a lot of spin down in this zone. But a lot of times some of the stronger hurricanes that happen will come right out of the northwestern Caribbean, move into the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico. And Helene is definitely going to be one of those powerful tropical cyclones. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this live update. We are going to push it east and do the best that we can to help out. Probably bring in some supplies, maybe walk in there with a chainsaw as well. But it's right in the backyard of my mom, too, up there near the North Carolina, South Carolina border. Perry was pretty bad, Derek. Some trees down, and definitely some structural damage, but not as bad as it could have been. We had a maximum wind of 108 miles an hour down there in Perry, and the winds didn't feel quite as powerful as they could have, even though there is quite a bit of damage. Down there near Keaton Beach, though, a lot worse down there near Keaton Beach. And definitely Keaton Beach down towards Steinhatchee. That 20-foot storm surge that came in probably had winds close to 140 miles an hour down there. A lot of damage down near Keaton Beach. So basically east of St. Mark's, that's where you had that dangerous onshore flow, down a little bit closer to Steinhatchee, and Keaton Beach got hammered. Perry, not as bad, Derek Hall. And then we had to get through all those trees, went back to Alligator Point. And we are going to have the subsonic sensor sent back to us to look at some of that infrasound data. Yeah, Gherkin's heading down there as well. No, it does not look like a hurricane's coming to the west coast of Florida, but the CMC model last night did show that. And I could show you that right now just to go through, just so that we cover all these models. But it is the only model that shows that too, so you don't want to just focus on one model. And you're looking at the 12Z, which is the most recent CMC. It has a much weaker, kind of a subtropical hybrid type system with a lot of the rain upstream of it because of that west to east shear out here. But last night's CMC model did show a stronger tropical cyclone making landfall near the west coast of Florida and just trucking right across the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And even though it looks like a bit of a half-a-cane, it is probably a Category 1 hurricane or a high-end tropical storm coming in to the Tampa Bay area. This would cause big problems out there and could easily happen. Good news is that you have this high off to the north that should prevent this from just launching right up into the southern Appalachians, including western North Carolina as well. The European model does have some slightly stronger members coming toward the west coast of Florida. We will have to keep an eye on that. You can see some of those stronger members headed up in that direction. Still some discrepancies with timing. The darker blue, that means that you have lower pressures and more agreement amongst those lower pressures as well. But we still need this to form, and it may not, but it does look like it's going to form over the western Gulf of Mexico later portion of this weekend, and then could just truck across the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico. Warm waters, but some westerly wind shear should keep it in check, and maybe not blossoming into a high-end hurricane, but probably be more of a subtropical low, tropical storm, tropical depression, maybe Category 1 hurricane if that CMC model is correct. Definitely no need to panic, not even close. Probably more of a rainmaker over the west coast of Florida, basically from Tampa down toward Key West. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this live update. We'll continue to keep you updated. The National Hurricane Center is monitoring that area with a 40% chance of development over the next 7 days. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this live update. We are going to be in western North Carolina here in about 18 hours or so. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Never stop chasing.